Let's see. Welcome, everyone. I'm just going to wait a little bit for everyone to come on. We're almost halfway there. All right. Give it another minute. Let people log on and we'll get started. Oh, I'm saying this to everybody instead of, hold on. This is great. Thank you for joining us. We're just waiting for a few more people to join us. We're streaming live on Facebook and through Zoom with Derek Weidman this evening. Okay, I think we can get started. Welcome everyone. My name is Kristen Muller and I'm the Executive Director of Peters Valley School of Craft, located in Layton, New Jersey. And tonight's program is sponsored by the Greater Pike County Community Foundation through the Richard L. Snyder Fund. And this lecture series really began in partnership with the Pike County Library in Pike County, Pennsylvania, in Milford, Pennsylvania. And we're just across the river in Layton, New Jersey. We're so happy to partner with the Pike County Library to bring artist lectures, not just to our region, but now through Zoom to the world. I mean, nationwide, we've had people connect from all over the place. So tonight we welcome Derek Weidman, who is a pretty amazing artist. He was born in 1982, so he's pretty young. And he lives in rural Pennsylvania, just outside of Philadelphia. And he started his journey studying philosophy in college, but he's a born artist. He was probably influenced by his father, who's a bird carver, and learned how to carve wood, but he began turning in 2003. And when he started turning on the lathe, he really approached it as a sculptor, primarily exploring and pushing the boundaries of multi-axis turning. His main effort was to try to create a visually descriptive and versatile language born out of the arsing and circular cuts of a lathe. And he spent over a decade building up a vocabulary of shapes and cuts. And an addendum, he's always loved drawing, right?
Yes.
So, all right, welcome, Derek. We are looking forward to your presentation. Just for everyone, we've got the chat. If you want to let us know where you're tuning in from, we love to hear where people are coming from. And if you're not familiar with Zoom, if you go to the very bottom of the page and you scroll down, there's a little symbol that says Q&A. If you've got questions for Derek, please put them into the Q&A section, and after he finishes his presentation, I will ask him some questions so we can find out some more. So thank you and welcome, Derek.
Thank you, Kristen. Hi, everybody. So I'm not sure exactly what all I'm going to talk about tonight, but I'll go over some of my thoughts about being a sculptor. And I'll go over, a number of the pieces that I've made throughout my career, and I'll just talk. It'll be pretty free form. I'm not a planner. by any stretch of the imagination. For any of you that have ever seen me demonstrate, you know how I run things. Anyway, so one thing I do find interesting as I was kind of thinking about what I might talk about tonight, like you can ask an artist how they made something, and you'll get a pretty concrete answer on and consistent. Oh, well, I did this, and that's how I ended up with these results. But I feel like you could ask an artist why they made something and it could be the same piece over various parts of their career, and they'll kind of have a different, like that piece will end up filling a different or it will fit into their like context as an artist differently throughout their career. So, you know, I was thinking about how I'll talk about certain pieces, and it's, you know, you could ask me, you know, 10 years ago, and I'm sure that how I talked about it would be different than how I talk about it now. Okay, so let me see. So I'm going to try to share screen here. Go to my slideshow. And then from beginning. So that should be showing my slides. This
It is. We're good. We can see you.
Okay, perfect. So this slideshow is, you know, I apologize for the somewhat dated graphics. It's, you know, it's pretty old, but it's, you know, updated with new work as I make it. But the general outline of it has not changed. So I guess I'll just start as just saying, so I'm a woodturner, and I would describe myself as a kind of just natural rule breaker. And it's not like I like getting into trouble or anything like that. I just, if there is a way that things could be done, and basically my entire career as a student, I was difficult for teachers, because if they said do something this way, my natural inclination is to see if there's any other way that I could do it that would still fit their ideas or their rules, but would essentially break what their expectations were. And when I got involved with wood turning, now quite a few years ago, it was amazing how rigid of a art form it was. Not to say that there weren't an unbelievable wealth of makers doing really incredible and innovative stuff all the time, but the field at large, it was very much round and brown was kind of like what was, that was the norm. And round and brown meaning that it's, you know, however it came off the lathe, not a whole lot of additional embellishment, and, you know, no colors, no nothing on it. Now, I am by no means an innovator in color, and I am not I'm not the originator of multi-axis work either. However, the scope of where I took multi-axis work on a wood lathe, and some of the forms that I ended up making and focusing over this past decade exploring, I feel like I can really, I can say fairly that I have pushed the lathe to places that it hadn't necessarily been before, at least in some small way. So, you know, this mandrel here that shows on the first slide, that is as much a wood turning as, you know, the table leg in your dining room. You know, the machinery is mostly the same. Obviously, there's some carvers, some carving techniques that have been added on this, but the bones of this piece were made on a wood lathe. And as I'll go through the slides, you'll kind of see. But that just as a preface, I thought that was useful to talk about. Okay, so when I first started doing multi-axis work, Um, I, so I studied with Mark Safiri, and he was a really huge innovator of multi-axis work. And it's funny because he did this, one class he did, I happened to not be there, and apparently he turned like a multi-axis head. And I actually never even saw what he made because the demo piece wasn't sitting around. But just that idea, what would a human head look like, or at least human head-like features look like expressed through a wood lathe? What would that mean? I just found that idea captivating. So as I started working and exploring kind of like how the lathe cut, and what were the limits of its descriptive language, a human head was the first thing I chose. And I chose a human head. So there's some like a rule of thumb ideas about abstraction. So say if like a human head is one of those things that's super familiar. Everyone knows, like, we're hardwired to pick up human faces. Like if you look in the clouds or a pile of dust or whatever, it's this thing where we recognize patterns, pareidolia. But human faces are primary in like how we're very good at picking them up visually. So there's a lot of play in how to represent a human face and still have it read as a human face, as opposed to like a marmot. Like if you're trying to communicate the idea of a marmot, you have, for one, it's not, I don't know how familiar any of you are with marmots, and for you, that are very, huge marmot fans, I don't mean to offend you, but by and large, if you were to try to communicate the idea of a marmot, you'd have to be very accurate, and you couldn't abstract it as much as a human face and communicate that idea successfully. Anyway, so I just feel like a human face you can really abstract. It's the easiest, it's the lowest hanging fruit to try to express that visually with a machine that cuts in a very limited way. And actually, limited may be, again, the wrong word, in a particular way. So this piece, it was for a show. Well, anyway, so right prior to that, so I started trying to turn these human faces, and it was really cool once I kind of figured out these series of cuts that worked. And it wasn't like, oh, what cuts would work, and I just kind of like conceptualized it in my head. It took me kind of like stumbling and bumbling through all these different cuts, and finally I found some group of cuts that the relationship worked out, that you got a human head after you're done, or something at least closely approximated it or communicated that idea. But at the time, again in the field, so I kind of mentioned the round and brown, but one other thing that was kind of a primary driver was that things were, there's no tear out, everything's like kind of cut and sanded beautifully, and the forms I was making, because it was multi-axis, which there's lots of interrupted cuts. If you're familiar with woodturning, you might understand that, but it does not leave the prettiest surface. And especially when I started doing it, it left a particularly ugly surface, or what the field or the most woodturners would consider an ugly surface. So I felt like I needed to take these forms and then kind of like put a more polished like skin on them. But it was nice because it also let me kind of like do some narrative work. So now finally getting around to this piece in particular. So after I was doing these human head forms that were, vaguely human head, like as I scroll through, you'll see kind of like the similarities. I would, so this was Gaia, which is, she's like a female earth goddess, as well as like a planet. And that like, spanning those two ideas was like a perfect subject matter for a form that is being made on a machine that cuts in circles, or at least I felt it to be. But instead of like mountains and rivers, I I covered it with animals, because what I found out later is that fauna, earth fauna is like that's like that's my wheelhouse. Like, that's what I really care about. So anyway, so this piece is Gaia, and it was, one of the, it was kind of like my first real step into the field's eyes, as it were. And it also happened to be, I think it was the first piece that I got into a museum. Art is cool. Oh, hold on. You still there?
Yep, we're here.
Yeah, we are.
Okay. Okay, good. So here's another piece. I don't need to talk quite as much about it. But so there is a kind of a cool story behind it. When I was making this piece, so this piece, as well as this piece, and actually all of these head forms I made while I was still in college. And now, so this piece, I worked nights at UPS while I was getting through school. And I saw these raccoons, like, it was a mother. She crossed the street, and I saw like these babies like tentatively trying to follow her. And then like cars were coming, and like they both kind of like, they never got on the same side of the street, and it was like, it kept being like 1 inch away from one of either the mother or the babies getting hit by a car. So me being an absolute lunatic, I just turned my car sideways on the road. And, traffic stopped, they got across the street, and that was it. So what I had initially planned on this piece being called Shared Thought, everything's kind of like of one mind, and like, I don't like, essentially all life is connected in some way. I guess that was in some, and I'm not trying to be, I guess, trite about that. But I ended up kind of gearing it more towards, or at least a little bit more towards, because it was at night and there was something kind of mischievous about the whole thing. So it ended up being pan, hence the horns and just kind of like the style of the face. So this was just really, it's very hard to pick up the turning exactly on this, but in some ways you can still see it. But so it's holly, and it was actually one of the first times I really started using holly. And the thing that I liked about this is that like the face almost reads like marble, while the wood, now it's all one piece, it's just burned, that reads very much like wood, and there's just like a nice visual juxtaposition of those two things. But I'm just going to scan through all 3 of these again. I wish I had a pointer, but I don't. But if you kind of like, if you look at the arc of the nose, and you can kind of see that there is a connective line through all of these, and it's how they were shaped initially on the lathe. And actually, if you were to look, so there's that arc that goes like kind of across the eyes and where the nose is. So that's one cut. You guys can see my face as well, so I'm kind of like pointing at that. Does that work? Can you guys see that as well? My face.
That makes sense.
Okay. So then there's also that arc that goes up, that goes like kind of up, and that is consistent on all of them. So that is like, that ring gets, it's very hard to explain visually. So I'm going to probably just not going to continue it. But anyway, there's there is a consistency in the anatomy of these heads, and it's because of how they were created on the lathe. Now, so this piece, I was really interested in kind of mythologies at this point, and how they are kind of avatars of bigger ideas, and a lot of times they're like tied to some collection of animals as well. So this piece was Brigid, who I think it was a Gaelic myth. And she was like a goddess of rebirth of some stripe. And there was just it was a really interesting collection of animals that were associated with her. So it was like a falcon, a horse, a cow, a swan, a snake, and a fox, I think, and perhaps some others as well, but those are the ones that are represented on this piece. And again, there's something about, taking these really, I don't know if I'd say complicated, but there's a very specific collection of ideas in these, these mythological characters. And then trying to represent them in some concrete way I found appealing, in particular because a lot of times there's all these different animals associated with it. So to try to tie them all together into one thing was appealing. And it was a really good, way to kind of like cut my teeth on like carving finer and representing more things. Okay, so, but there was a lot of consistency or tightness in the shape. So it was like basically that one head form, and then there was some degree of wiggle room in it to make it like express different things. But if you were to look at, so take a real close look at the nose of Brigid, and you can see that there's like these like lines that kind of like cut up like the form, like where the structures are. There's these lines, and I thought, well, I could almost blow that up, and that could just be a piece. And I thought about, well, I could turn it too, so all those different facets were just kind of like turned as well, or at least to some degree. So what I started doing was I wanted to see like what a rhino might look like if I, used a wood lathe to try to describe it. And there's absolutely, so maybe, I'm trying to remember exactly, like when I first started doing this, I had to plan, so when I came up with that head form, it was like sorcery. Like I would not, I can't imagine ending up at that form now, just because of the way that I think about things now, and I've done it for so long. But because it was so iterative, and it wasn't like conceived at once. It was like conceived over time through a process. And that way of designing is not intuitive even a little bit. So it led to a very unique endpoint. And I kind of left that always in my process. So it's not like I conceive of these things and say, okay, well, multi-axis rhino is going to look like this. I let the process through time design, like I'm guiding it. Like it's kind of like I'm letting it make some visual decisions for me. And I'm just kind of guiding that process, and then wherever that endpoint is, I'll either decide, yes, that's far enough, or no, it's not, and I'll kind of work towards that. But anyway, so this was the first animal of the animal series that now have, I don't know how many, I'm sure that I've done over 100 animals now, but this was the first. So I did this residency in Philadelphia, at the Center for Art and Wood, which was at that point the Woodturning Center. Um, and this one thing that in hindsight about this piece, not that I don't like it, I love this piece, but I was still borrowing heavily from kind of like I really like. Actually, hold on. I'll finish this off, but then I'm going to go back and talk about this for a second. But I was borrowing really, so as I was talking about those head forms, I was like studying all these different cultures, and then also looking at like the work that was the cultural art that was associated at those times of that work, and kind of bringing those motifs into the pieces to some degree. And but in that process, I was borrowing a lot of visual qualities that were not mine. You know, they were from other cultures. But now the thing is, to talk about this for a second again, one of the things that actually really inspired these animal forms, and so I love Inuit artwork. And the one thing that I found so captivating about it in particular was, so say if you saw a bear that was carved, there is a quality about it that is unmistakable to that region. You know, there is just like the way there's like a visual language to it. And but say if there was a seal, okay, also there's like this consistent visual language to it. But you know, you've seen seals, you've seen Inuit bears, you've seen Inuit seals. But now let's say they carved a TV. I feel like there is a consistent filter that a lot of cultures they developed, and they developed these very consistent and thorough visual filters in the same way that we have descriptive languages, regular languages, like word-based languages. So those visual languages, I found them amazing, and that you look at different cultures from around the world, and they have these fully fleshed out, internally logical visual languages, and I just thought, boy, that would be kind of cool to try to develop one. And there's simply no way to just say, well, okay, I'm going to come up with a visual language, and I'm going to have really big eyes, and like, you know, kind of like it would be so arbitrary to try to come up with all the things that are actually necessary to have a consistent visual language. Not to say that one couldn't, but my approach was, if I just try to use a machine that has a very particular way of cutting, and to try to have that describe a whole lot of things, there's going to be internally consistent things about it because of the way that it cuts. So in that way, my process imparted so much to my style. Now that doesn't mean that my taste and my whatever still are expressed through it, because you know, this rhino in some ways, it's very consistent to my work, but as you'll see as my work develops, I feel like I get a little bit closer to maybe a clear window into my style, but still consistent with the process. You know, there's all these different factors that are coming out in probably anyone's work, and you know, there's no right or wrong to it. It just is what it is, and it's interesting to see how all of those factors, you know, come into play at different parts in someone's career. So now, okay, so with this mandrel here, you can clearly see that I'm borrowing some visual components from, I don't know what I don't know what culture, but you can see that there are some cultural influences that are not. It's certainly not my taste, or not. I'm sorry, not my taste, not my designs. Not they're not speaking of my culture, which I really have tried to, make the decoration on top of these forms also mine to some extent as I've gotten older. So this piece, people made in the same residency as that one. Technically, though, the form was sandblasted, which just worked really beautifully with obviously a rhino form. Like they just play very well together. I think the horns were ebony. Gosh, I better start moving. I'm blabbing a lot, and I have a lot of slides. So, much more needs to be said about that. People like that one, but it's funny. Just quickly to note, that rhino versus this rhino is there's a world apart. There are a world apart, but there is still some consistency, obviously tying them together. This piece. It was a little bit more narrative than most of the animal forms that I've made. So it's Asterion, which is basically the name for the Minotaur. So it's has kind of like that Minoan vessel shape to it, or certainly borrowing from that. And if you notice in the carving, there's a female letting a bird go, and a male with like a torch instead, almost like a soldier, but he's carrying a torch instead of like a weapon. And you can't see it, but on the there's a pile of weapons on the back on a panel with a bull. So a pile of weapons and a bull looking down at them. And actually, in that pile of weapons is they're like kind of tucked away as like some sort of missile. But the parable of the Minotaur is a lot of like getting kind of outside of the nastier parts of our human condition. Kind of, letting go of and not being the monster. So anyway, and also the decoration on this is in fact a maze, and there is only one way to get through it, because I'm just mad. Just a Doberman. I'm not a whole lot to say about it. I'm going to rush through some of these and try to just talk about some of the ones that are. This one was interesting just in that the lights and the darks of the zebra were developed three-dimensionally instead of, via, pigment, which I thought was cool. And I think the mouth, like that, you call it a butterfly would be unreasonable, but it's, to kind of hold those cracks together. Is pink ivory. This deer, smile-eyed whitetail, it was actually made out of a piece of poplar that came down on the Escherich Museum, on the grounds. And that was cool because they gave a whole bunch of local artists, and actually anyone who is in Pennsylvania, Jersey, New York, or if you're ever in those areas and you're in Pennsylvania in particular, and you have the chance to go to the Escherich Museum, I highly recommend it. It is it's one of the coolest places in the world as far as I'm concerned. You just have to, he is a very special artist, and his house is worth seeing. Anyway, so this tree came down on his property, and they gave a bunch of artists a piece of it to make whatever they would. So I made this deer out of it, somewhat certainly inspired by his sensibilities. River King, so just hippo. Really, if you are discerning, you can see the various cuts. Very little additional shaping was done. Basically, it is just a hippo form, came straight off the lathe, basically like that. Teeth were added, and then a lot of carving was done on it, and some drift fluid was inlaid. Like, I mean, there's a lot of additional work, but the shaping of it was almost entirely done on the wood lathe. So this is Father's Watch. Again, so my dad was he did a lot of carving. Like, basically, as I grew up, he always was. He doesn't carve as much as he did. Like, I grew up in wood carving shows, so like it's just in my blood. And there's 3 eggs in there, and there's you know, I have 2 siblings, and it's a little autobiographical, and I don't really need to get into the specifics of it, but you know, it's just very much speaking to my life without being overt about it. And one thing I will say, I do think that so I'm a professional artist in that I make my living selling my work. And I have seen people have to be mindful of I don't know if the economics of selling are taught as much as they should be. And I have seen people, art students in particular, make work that is just technically beautifully done, incredible amounts of skill. But their personal narrative is so strong in it that it's almost uncomfortable to expect someone else to like have that, just because it's so it is so in their face, and sometimes emotional turmoil is, you know, it's very hard to it'll be very hard to live with someone else's, and I guess, you know, art can be therapy, but if art is your job, you have to be careful about how you are treating yourself basically with your artwork. Binfo, being a very huge art hero of mine. He was, you know, he lived through the fall of Vietnam, and I mean, he was literally in Saigon as it fell to communist forces. He was in a prison camp. He was in prison camps. He had to escape, I think, 3 times to finally get out. But the way he talked about that it was butterflies and just them representing freedom to him. And that loose connection, I think is our job as artists, to try to, sometimes we have to be able to communicate to other people, and it has to touch other people, as opposed to it just being, you know, something for ourselves. Now, that might be me being a little bit too preachy, and I'm sure there's a million ways for an artist to be different, of course. But I do think that it is worth considering, the audience. So this piece, As Above, So Below, compositionally, I thought it was interesting. Just a bird and a fish being basically the same, with a horizon line and a sun kind of setting in between the two. Just some carved bees. The honey is actually wood glue, and if you let wood glue set up like that, it is amazingly close to what honey looks like. So this is sage grouse. This was ended up being a really important piece of mine. It's the first piece I had on like a large national like cover of a magazine. Really tricky technical piece. Here's a phoenix. So this piece was kind of interesting in that it was, I guess both of them in some way, but this one in particular, like, so there were multiple multi-axis forms that were then joined together into one piece. And doing that, which I hadn't really done before, opened up a ton of compositional territory. I mean, it's just hard to imagine that that is turned, but so much of it is, in fact. So this is a, I just want to take a look at the time really quick. So this is a Green Man. Not a whole lot to say about it. It was just, I was interested with the form and to see what it would look like expressed with a lathe. Here's a bison in snow. Again, you can see like the really strong. I've only more and more appreciated the strength of just like those circular cuts and leaving them on the forms. So here's a dog with a ball in its mouth. So this ended up being a really important piece of mine because someone asked me, you know, what's your favorite piece? And as I mentioned all the way back with that rhino piece, it's not one, it is, you know, it's the whole language. The language, so when someone says, what's your favorite piece? I just said all of them. Just all of these pieces in one piece so people could actually see the idea of them being a visual language was important to me. And obviously the scale as well, you know, it's a very large work. Okay, now I volunteer at a wildlife rescue, and that has been, so I've done that for about 6 years now, and it has been just hugely influential on my work. So this piece I made for an auction. Now it's not like a, it is by no means like a really carefully done or like a skill or a time intensive work. But so it was for an auction, and it was to help feed this guy right here, Remy, who was at the auction or at the rescue for 2 years. So we were both, so this is a pretty old picture, pre-beard. But I, you know, so getting to deal with the wildlife has been just amazingly, it's just become a larger and larger part of my life and my work. This piece was also for an auction there, which was a like turned hands holding a bird with an injured wing. Another auction piece, this one I actually did this year, and it was not for the place I volunteer at, but it was a place that actually takes some of the animals that come in that are really in a bad spot. So this place, Sanctuary Gate Farm, I think. Yeah, it's a place in Upper Black Eddy. But they have like multiple goats that are like in wheelchairs like this. And the one goat's name was Happy. So I made this piece for that auction, and you know, I really like giving back when I can. And I started just doing work in general that was a little bit more environmentally themed. So this was when that pipeline was about to be built through Alaska. And I kind of view the idea as like there is a way for human progress to be done that does not need to fight in every single way with like environmental concerns and human progress do not need to be pitted against each other. And there's ways for things to be done that I think are just smart and they could meet both ends. So this piece is kind of in that idea, like how to build things beautifully. This one, so there are these chimps in Basel, I think it's some place in Africa, I think, certainly was. But these chimps were disarming traps. And it was almost like a altruistic behavior by them. It served them no benefits, they were just kind of like helping the other. They noticed that it was hurting animals in the area, and it appeared that they were disarming them for the well-being of other creatures. Now, again, that could be, some degree of anthropomorphizing, but it also could be just simply the case that they are a compassionate creature. They certainly are a compassionate creature, and they could have been just exhibiting compassion like humans can. Certainly they are thinking creatures, and I just was moved by it. So this piece was Saint of Basel. So it's kind of like it turned like a trap into almost like a religious, sky piece, hat, with like stained glass detailing on the trap. So just a falcon. I'm going to zip through these just so you guys see them. I'll talk about this one quick. Cecil. This was that lion that was poached a few years ago. That was like lured out of a sanctuary so this jackass Dennis could shoot it. And so I try not to ever work from places that are like tragic or sad. But what I was moved by, I was not moved by the fact that this Dennis who killed this lion. I was moved though by how enormous of a reaction it was globally that someone did it. It was viewed as a tragedy. And that to me, there's just something about that I thought was really special. So this was my reaction to that piece, or to that story. And this piece is actually in the Peabody Essex Museum now, permanently. So I got kind of really interested in how lathe cuts impart movement. So I did this woodpecker, and then I've done a lot of these now because I've heard people say you can almost hear it pecking. So this was the first iteration, and now this is a more recent one. You can see how much more movement has been imparted in it. But anyway, I really love how graphic those cuts and how they imply movement. Again, so here's like a crab with it's like actively pinching. This image is really blurry, but so it's essentially like a bird feeder, and there's birds flying all to and fro from different branches. This was the biggest piece I'd made to date. I'm actually working on a bigger one now. But this was all a body of work of just moving birds. Just expressions of that visual language. I'll talk about this and a few more pieces, then we can open it up to questions, and I think that will be pretty good timing, right?
Yes.
Okay. So this, I think, is the trickiest turning I've ever done. So people that are familiar with wood turning probably know about or have heard about like basket illusions. So it's like these little beads, and you turn rows of beads, and then you can add like the lines in it. Some people do these really ridiculous mathy patterns, and they're really amazing. But I had never seen anyone try to do one like multi-axis. So and the thing was, there's a couple of reasons for it. You can't cheat it much. Like everything kind of has to be, like all of your cuts have to be right. And they all have to be beaded, and it all has to be it has to make sense in some way. So there was very little room for error on this. But so all of those beads, like the rows across, they were cut that way. And then obviously there was a lot of lines drawn on it as well to actually add the beads and the horns. I mean, there were things added to it, but the form itself, it's just a turned form. And I guess it stands a little somewhere around 2 feet or so high. That's with the bird as well. But so the title's Wishing Tatanka. And conceptually, it was just if what the society that we lived in was like essentially we're not living on top of a genocide is what the idea of this piece was. And again, I don't have that overtly, but like it would have been neat to have seen what our culture could have been like if, like I kind of made it as if our cultures were more intermingled as opposed to just like one having completely supplanted another. Now this is actually, I have been doing, this is like my pandemic series, not literally, but I call them life spirals. This was another auction piece that I did. So the patterning on it, so it's just like a turned disc, and then I run the lathe in reverse with a chainsaw, and I just pull it across the surface, and you get like that patterning. And then I've done a lot of birds, you know, with that process. And there's a ram. And so this will be the last slide. And so I did all of those different birds, and then I did that ram as well in the same process by kind of making a circular shape, like almost like a shallow bowl, and then pulling the chainsaw across the surface of it while everything's running. And then I just started doing some drawings on the lathe too, which I thought were kind of interesting. But yeah, so I'll leave it at that. That's, you know, a snapshot of, you know, my body of work. And feel free to ask any questions, and I'm be happy to answer them.
Great, thank you, Derek. Well, Gary Gunter is asking, what colors are you using? What is the type and the brand? And then it might be the same or similar question. LG Stylo 3+ is asking, what are the finishes you use on the richer colored ones like the mandrel and the Irish goddess?
Basically everything is acrylic. And I like acrylics because and I use Golden as the Golden brand. Some of the earlier works might be some other things, but I don't use anything other than that now because it's really highly rated color fast and it's just nice to know that the color is not going to change that. Well, I feel like in general, like if you're making artwork, you should try to consider how durable the piece is going to be once it gets out of your hands, both structurally, shape-wise, color-wise, everything. You know, as durable as it can be, the better.
Okay.
Yeah, acrylics.
Okay, and Lois Wells was asking, can you talk more about how you get some of your colors and shading? Well,
that's actually a good question. So basically, a lot of the lights and darks are already established because, so I use holly mostly, almost exclusively with my sculptures. And so it's a light, almost like a parchment white timber. So after the piece is shaped, I'll then blowtorch almost the entire surface, not to like scorch it, but just to like essentially burn off all the fuzz and darken all of the high points. So you get like this black outline, like it's almost like it's, you know, been drawn. And say if I add a color then at that point. So you kind of have these you'll have lights and darks already built in just because you have torched the wood. But then sometimes I'll actually cut back through that and you'll get some midtones as well. And basically the whole surface is, I can either, torch it a little bit more to darken it, or, cut back through the color. I have to be careful. So I'm using like really pretty thin washes. If I'm using golden high flow paints, they're actually for airbrushes. If you were to try to do this with like a thick bodied acrylic and you were to try to torch that, then it's going to bubble and be a mess. So it's imperative that it's just light washes.
That's great. Thank you. Tim Alley is asking how much of your current work time is spent carving and painting, like in terms of comparing to the actual turning?
It just depends. Certainly the most labor intensive part is the whatever shaping is done on the lathe. And it depends on the piece. Like some pieces, I'm almost loath to do anything other than add a little bit of color after it comes off the lathe. And then others, it's just a ton of time. Like the bison. Whoops. Well, like the bison is a perfect example because like the turning probably took, I don't know, 10 hours or more, something like that, which is it's a lot of time to be spending on the lathe. But then the rest of the work, all of the detail work, I mean, it was, I don't know, another 100 hours on top of that. But so much of the shaping was already done by the lathe, so it's hard to put it in percentages, I guess. But if it's just a strictly time thing, it could be as little as, or it could be as much as 50% and as little as 5.
Great, thank you. Sean Roberts says, thanks for a great talk. I was going to take your PV course this summer. What techniques do you teach in your workshops and what projects do you have students practice on?
So I really love the week-long class format because it's basically descriptive turning, and we'll use angle grinders, chainsaws, power carvers, you name it. But the heart of it is learning how to shape with a lathe, and I don't force you, and I don't force a student into, but like the last thing I would want to do is say, okay, do what I'm doing, because as a student, the last thing I want a teacher to say is do what I'm doing. So I try to leave it very open-ended, and I'll be the guide, and to try to teach you through your own experimentation via shaping. So basically, students, I'll have a few projects that it's like walk through, make this, do this cut, learn this. And then once we get into the meat of the class, it's okay, I want you to come up with a project and then we'll figure out how to get it done via these various processes.
Great.
Usually, pick an animal you want to make, but I wouldn't limit it to that if someone, for whatever reason, wanted to do something else. And then troubleshoot it. And I feel like learning through those mistakes or whatever is the best way to gain information.
One more question I've got here. Please explain the reversed lathe texturing.
Okay, so a chainsaw is, spinning like this, right? And if the lathe is spinning towards you like that, they're going to be doing this. Can you see that? So they'll be like essentially not letting, they'll not be letting themselves cut, because they'll both be spinning kind of towards each other in the same direction. So you can turn the lathe backwards or even just stand on the other side. It doesn't matter. But you just need to have the chainsaw pulling. You need to have the chainsaw pulling in a different direction, rotating in a different direction than the lathe is, basically. And you got to turn it down to a point that makes sense. And I can't tell you what the number makes sense is, but if it's too fast, it's not going to cut. So you turn it down a little bit, but it doesn't need to be going slow. And the different speeds of it are going to change like the pitch of the cut and like how fast it is cutting. And that means it'll just change the patterning that's happening on it. It's a fluid process. I would, if you're, for one, you have to, one second. So like this chainsaw, it's battery driven. And you can see how like narrow the tip is. Like you're going to take out your gas powered chainsaw and try to stick it on your lathe. You are not necessarily breaking any huge safety rules, but there should be some risk aversion in doing something like that. Like this little battery carver with a carving chain or a carving bar on it is just much more nimble and more appropriate for that kind of process. So, if you were to try that, I'm reluctant to advise it, but I wouldn't say that you shouldn't. But here's an example. I know in my heart that if someone were to hand me a flute or a piano, I am not going to be able to carry a tune on it. I have very little musical aptitude. I know that. Now imagine if one's musical aptitude, if I couldn't carry a tune, that meant that I might lose my ear. That is what taking a chainsaw to a lathe is like. If you feel like you have good hand skills, it almost feels natural. Like there's not a lot of risk in it. I pitch it at like 45 this way and 45 this way and just rake it across the surface. And it feels really natural. And it does have to be angled because otherwise it's just going to chatter and catch in a way that is not doing. Watch me demo it and then try it.
Thank you, Derek. I was like, do not try this at home.
Yeah, words are not going to do it justice. There's a way to do it, and then there's probably a whole lot of ways that I fortunately haven't found not to do it.
We're running out of time here. Quickly, an anonymous attendee says that your work looks overwhelming and impressive. And do you find that an average student can grasp the techniques that you teach, or do you need to be a serious, technically inclined artist already? Is this a class for advanced turners? I think the class is for skilled turners. I mean, at least an intermediate level, right? It's not a beginner.
My best students have been beginners.
Ah, okay. So beginner turners even?
Beginner turners.
Okay, there you go.
But now what I found is, because my work very much is a bridge between like kind of drawing and turning. So, and it actually is probably a little bit more drawing friendly than it is turning friendly. The actual shaping is like a bowl is harder to turn than the intro level work of this process. for sure. A bowl is much harder to turn. But there's a thinking component that runs at odds with a lot of wood turning, especially if people already have some ingrained ideas about it. It really rubs against those things. So people that come in with a blank slate do fine. That being said, a skilled turner or an experienced turner does have like the toolkit to do all of the things that they want to do once they can get their mind around it. So it's surprisingly easy place to it's a surprisingly successful class. I've been, and it's not just me, students have been like, it is a cool feeling when someone says, I can't draw a lick, but they're a skilled turner, and then they make this bobcat, and they're like, I can't believe I did that. I couldn't even carve it, and yet I turned it. And then from the other side, people that are not turners at all, they do these things and they just, they have no experience on the lathe, and so they're surprised kind of with anything that they did, and their work is incredible. So, yeah, I'm very comfortable saying that because I've now taught enough of these to know that people have a good time and it's accessible.
That's great. So LG Stylo 3 Plus says, thank you. I've been looking for a way to get a richer finish on my carvings, and I will try the high flow. Your finishes look so rich that I thought they might be oils. And then Tim Ailey says, drawing on the lathe, how much paint color while turning? I guess he means how much do you paint or color while you're actually turning? Do you do it on the lathe or do you do some of it off the lathe?
So the only thing that I've done is like the actual, just the paintings, like the these ones. So those are just like I use some markers while the lathe is spinning, and I'll just get those circles that way. But I've never colored a sculpture while it was spinning. Not that I haven't thought about it, I just haven't gotten around to it.
Well, thank you, Derek. That concludes our questions. Thank you very much for showing and sharing your beautiful work and your techniques. And just one quick announcement before we go, you can look for Derek's work on his website, and hopefully we'll be teaching next year. And wanted to also share with all of you tonight that we're having our virtual craft fair at Peters Valley online Saturday and Sunday. You can go to our website to find the way to link to our craft fair. And also we have an exhibition at the Hunterdon Art Museum that opened this past weekend. So it'll be up through January at the Hunterdon Museum in Clinton. It's called From the Ground Up, Peters Valley. And Derek, thank you so very much, and everyone for tuning in. Have a wonderful rest of your week. Have a good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.